Bobby Lee Claremont and the Criminal Element by Jeannie Mobley. McComb, Mississippi, 10:15 a.m. It was mid-morning when the train stopped in the small town of McComb for a few minutes. I stayed in my seat, but all three men traveling with Mrs. O'Halloran stepped off to stretch their legs and smoke on the platform. Mrs. O'Halloran tucked her still sleeping baby into his basket on the floor beside her seat and went to the lavatory. I was alone in the car, except for the baby and Sergeant Hayworth. I stole a glance his direction. He was leaning back in his seat, his hat over his face as if asleep. As quietly as I could, I slid across my seat until I was up against the dirty window. I wanted to see if the kid in the overalls was out there again, working the platform. I wanted to know what he was up to and if there was a payoff in it. I didn't see the boy, but I spotted the widow's companions right off. They stood in the dust outside the small clapboard depot looking a little uncomfortable. The small man in the pinstripes was lighting a cigar, cupping his hands around the flame as he did so, but his eyes were shifting back and forth between the others like he didn't trust them. Nobody was looking anybody in the eye. I took a page from the sergeant's book, closed my eyes, and leaned my head against the glass as if I were asleep. Unfortunately, with my eyes closed, I couldn't tell who was saying what, but I didn't want it to be obvious I was eavesdropping, so I resisted the urge to peek. "I don't like it," said a husky voice. "Keep your shirt on. There's nothing he can do now. He's Louisiana State Police and we're in Mississippi," said a second voice with a quick, pinched Yankee accent. "He's out of his jurisdiction, but that don't mean there's nothing he can do," said the first voice, getting lower and huskier with disapproval. "I don't like it. I don't want to see Miss LeBlanc getting hurt." "Nom de Dieu!" swore a third voice in Cajun French. "She ain't Miss LeBlanc anymore, Malcolm. How many times do I gotta tell you?" "Sorry, boss. Mrs. O'Halloran. I just don't want to see Mrs. O'Halloran getting hurt." I pressed a little harder against the glass. I didn't want her getting hurt either, even if I had only just met her. "No one's getting hurt," said the Yankee. "Just keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. She's got the insurance policy with her. She's got you as witnesses. Once she cashes out, we'll all be sitting pretty and there's nothing that cop can do. He's got nothing on any of us, and if nobody squeals, it'll stay that way." "Don't worry, Mr. Kelly. We ain't gonna squeal, are we, Malcolm?" said the Cajun. Sir?" said the husky voice that must have been Malcolm's. There was a silence then, broken by a shuffling, shifting sound on the dry earth, moving closer to the train. Then my nose prickled as a stream of cigar smoke came through the narrow opening in my window right into my face. I sat up, coughing, and opened my eyes, only to see the three men gathered right below my window, glaring up at me. I gave them a quick smile, or the closest to it I could, what with my eyes and lungs burning, a smile that I hoped said, "If you're a criminal, I sure would like a job." The small pinstripe fellow took a long drag on his cigar. His eyes regarded me with a steel-hearted chill. Off to their right, a conductor called, "All aboard!" and there was a scramble of passengers for the train, but that lean man didn't move. He just kept his blue eyes locked on mine and blew the smoke out of the corner of his mouth. My heart was racing, but I held his look with what I hoped was a steely gaze of my own. If I wanted to impress, I was going to have to start by showing a little grit. Behind him, his two large companions were getting restless. "Come on, Kelly," said the Cajun. But Kelly just stood, his eyes still holding mine, his thin lips turning slowly up into a smile. "Coming, Bujo," he said, but he didn't move or look away or even blink. "Just remember what I said. Mouth shut and no one gets hurt." Then he leaned closer to the gap in the window and spoke right into it. "And if you're pretending to be asleep, don't squeeze your eyes shut quite so tight." Then he crushed out his cigar with the heel of his shoe and strode to the door to board the car. All three men walked past my seat as they made their way up the aisle toward their own, but none of them even glanced my way. I watched their backs until they reached their seats. Then I turned my gaze away, not wanting them to see me staring as they sat down. I glanced instead across the aisle to where Sergeant Hayworth still sat with his hat over his face. Somehow, though, I sensed he was smiling. It seemed everyone on this train car had seen right through me. I turned my gaze back out the window as we rolled out of the station, past the squat houses and a sprawling sawmill. I watched it belch black smoke into the clear morning sky and tried to decide what to do. I'd gotten the criminals' attention, but not in the way I'd hoped. At least I was pretty sure they were criminals now, though I didn't exactly understand what they'd been talking about. Personally, I was all for the idea of nobody getting hurt, but the way that Yankee had said it, it sounded more like a threat than an assurance. And why had the big man called Mrs. O'Halloran Miss LeBlanc? Was she not really the widow of the dead man in the baggage car? An actress, perhaps, hired to scam the dead man's relatives? She had as much told me she'd been on the stage, but her story had felt true, and she had that baby. No, I didn't think she was an actress, but something wasn't right here. I thought back to the Yankee's words about my insurance money. Suddenly a new thought twisted hard in my belly. Mrs. O'Halloran's companions were somehow fixing to take advantage of her and her predicament. If that happened, her baby would surely grow up as I had, a burden to his mother as she went from job to job. My own mother had always hugged me and cried and told me I was her whole life whenever she lost another job. She'd quit because she missed me too much, she said, but I knew her dismissals were my fault. Folks wanted a cleaning lady who would put in long hours, not one who had to stop early to take care of a child, or worse yet, had the brat tagging along with her. More than once, Mammon had found work as a domestic in one of the big houses on St. Charles Street, where they expected her there night and day. She'd leave me with the sisters to take the job, but it would never last more than a month. When I was little, I'd always been so happy when she came back. It wasn't until I was older that I understood she was giving up a warm, dry bed and 3 square meals a day so we could be a family. Her, me, and a million cockroaches in a cheap room. If she hadn't come back to me, she wouldn't have gotten sick. And once she was sick, no one would hire her. No one wants a maid who's coughing up blood. I wouldn't wish that on Mrs. O'Halloran. I had to protect her. Then I remembered with a jolt why I was on this train to begin with. This was what criminals did. How was I going to get into a crime ring if I went all soppy at the sight of every widow I stumbled across? This was my big chance, and I couldn't let it slip through my fingers. I cleared my head and hardened my heart and thought again about what I had overheard. Something about an insurance policy that would cash out. I didn't rightly know what an insurance policy was, but I knew what cash was, and I knew that, whatever folks might say to the contrary, it would buy plenty of happiness. What I didn't understand was why it would have Mrs. O'Halloran's 3 companions sitting pretty, as that Yankee, Mr. Kelly, had said. What right did they have to any insurance money? Deep down, I knew the answer to my question. Most likely they had no right. They were criminals, and they took what they wanted, and I admired that in them. But despite my efforts to harden my heart, it still didn't set right with me that their target was a widow and an orphan. I tried to think of reasons I might be wrong about them until a wonderful possibility dawned on me. Maybe they were somehow stealing insurance money for Mrs. O'Halloran and her baby. In that case, they were exactly the sort of criminals I would want to fall in with. Being an orphan myself, it seemed to me that taking money from an insurance company to help a widow and her baby, and keeping a little on the side for yourself, was a nice way to profit all the way around. Somehow or other, Mrs. O'Halloran and that baby were the key to all this, and I reckoned that if I could speak to her privately, I could get her to tell me more. She'd sensed in me the kindred spirit of someone who'd lost a loved one. That connection had opened her heart and loosened her tongue. I was sure it would again. And then I'd know whether these were the criminals for me or not. I glanced her way, wondering how I'd get her alone. only to discover that she was. Her companions had left the carriage while I'd been lost in my thoughts. It was almost too easy. I rose from my seat and strode with determination toward the widow, planning to plant myself in the seat opposite her, bold as anything. But just as I came beside her seat, just as her eyes landed on mine and there was no going back, that pin-strapped Yankee stepped to the door at the end of the carriage and stood not 3 paces away from us. I must have blanched at the sight of him because Mrs. O'Halloran's warm smile faltered and she turned, almost in alarm. When she saw who had surprised me, her smile became warm and comfortable once again. "Oh, Bobby Lee, this is Mr. Brian Kelly. Mr. Kelly is an old friend of Jimmy's from Chicago. They grew up together. Mr. Kelly, this is Bobby Lee Claremont. He helped calm little Jimmy a while ago. He's got a fine touch with babies. Won't you sit down, Bobby Lee?" I glanced again at Mr. Kelly. He looked back with hard eyes, his eyebrows lifting slightly in a question. "Well, kid, you've put your foot in it now. What are you going to do about it?" In answer, I gave Mrs. O'Halloran a smile, thanked her, and slid into the seat facing her. "Tell that to the crime bosses of Chicago, Brian Kelly. I've got nerves of steel." "What do you want, kid?" Kelly said, sliding into the seat next to the beautiful widow, whose big dark eyes were asking the same question in a much kinder tone. I swallowed and thought fast. I had planned to just ask what had happened to her husband, but that was before Mr. Kelly had stepped into the plan. You, my voice quavered, and I decided to use that to my advantage. I swallowed again, hard and obvious this time, like I was real choked up. "It's just that you said it would help to talk," I said, turning my attention on the widow. "And you were right about me. I lost someone too, my mother. That's why I'm going to Chicago to my aunt." Memories of Mammon bobbed to the surface of my thoughts, and just like that, the lump in my throat was real, even though I'd meant to only be faking. Mrs. O'Halloran's face was all compassion, her brow wrinkling and her eyes growing moist. "Oh, you poor boy," she said, twisting her handkerchief between her hands. "You poor, poor boy. Here I've been so wrapped up in my troubles I never thought about what you were going through. How did she die?" I closed my eyes for a moment and drew in an unsteady breath, seeing Mammon again at the last, withered and coughing until she couldn't breathe, until she was choking on her own blood. "Consumption," I said. "She'd been sick for now a year." "I'm so sorry," she said, and gave a deep, sad sigh. At least I was spared the pain of seeing Jimmy weakened by illness. He was full of life to the last. This was the opening I'd been looking for, and I jumped on it. "He was? What happened to him?" "That's none of your business," Kelly said. But Mrs. O'Halloran put her hand on his arm in a gentle reprimand. "No, it's okay," she said. "I don't mind saying. Jimmy fell, Bobby Lee, from a third-story window." "How'd he fall out a window?" Her brow squeezed tighter, but she didn't draw back from the memory. "A rail on the balcony gave way. But never mind. You came to tell me about your mother. Was there nothing the doctors could do for her?" I shook my head. "Couldn't afford a doctor," I said. "The Sisters of Charitable Mercy took care of her son, but there was not much they could do." "What about your sister?" Mrs. O'Halloran asked. "It was just me and Mammon," I said. She gave me a curious look, and I remembered the lie I'd told earlier. I felt my face redden. I was usually better at lying than this. Lord knows I'd claimed to be everything from a choir boy to a soldier in the Salvation Army to separate sweet old ladies from their spare change. But talking of Mammon's death had thrown me off. "Truth is, I don't have a sister, ma'am. It was Sister Bernadette of the Charitable Mercies who taught me to take care of babies." "I see," Mrs. O'Halloran said, smiling. "What did I tell you?" Brian Kelly burst in. "I don't believe a word of this tragic cock-and-bull story. His ma's probably a back-alley con, same as him. Unless he's a snitch for the cops." "I am not," I said, glaring at the sharp little Yankee. I don't want anything to do with the cops. I just want to know how Mr. O'Halloran died, that's all. I felt bad, thinking you and the baby might end up like Mammon and me, alone and poor. I thought maybe I could help." "How very kind of you, Bobby Lee," Mrs. O'Halloran said, putting a gentle hand on my knee. "Please don't mind, Mr. Kelly. It's been so hard for all of us. It's very kind of you to be concerned, but you needn't be. We are taken care of." I waited a moment for her to say more, but she didn't, so I put on a worried look. "Are you sure? It's just—" I hesitated, glancing at Mr. Kelly, who was still glaring at me. I hadn't convinced him I was a good kid, so I hoped I'd at least convinced him I was a decent con. "Just what?" she asked gently. "It's just that the policeman seems to think you might be in trouble. That's what he told me. I didn't ask, but that's what he said." She smiled then, a wide, amused smile. "Oh, Bobby Lee, you are sweet. Here you've got so much trouble of your own and you're worried about me." "So you aren't in any trouble?" I ventured. "Jimmy died in his club. So, of course, the police are investigating," Mrs. O'Halloran said. "There's coppers for you, harassing honest citizens, following us all the way to Chicago when he's got no right," Mr. Kelly growled. "Now, Mr. Kelly," Mrs. O'Halloran said mildly, but Kelly's face was turning crimson right to the roots of his hair. "And now he's sent this kid over here asking questions. They're trying to pin this on somebody, and they won't rest until they do. That's how coppers operate. They refuse to believe a railing broke by accident. 'He must have been pushed,' they say. 'Maybe there was a fight.' And then if they can't find the Charlie who actually pushed Jimmy, they have to think up something else. Maybe his widow had him bumped off to collect the life insurance. Maybe his childhood schoolmate has a secret grudge and came all the way down from Chicago to shove him out a window. Is that what you're digging for, kid? Well, no dice. We're not telling you nothing, and you and your cop friend ought to keep away from Mrs. O'Halloran and me and our associates. Understand?" "Now, Mr. Kelly, Bobby Lee's got nothing to do with police investigation. Do you, Bobby Lee?" Mrs. O'Halloran said. "I told you I didn't. I don't like any cops any more'n you do," I said, trying to meet the challenge in Kelly's eyes. "Well, since none of us have nothing to hide, none of us have nothing to fear." Mrs. O'Halloran said it bravely, but I could see the worry clumping up between her eyebrows. Kelly glanced over at Hayworth, still situated a few rows away, and hatred flashed in his eyes. "That copper is doing more than his job, Nanette. He's following us clear out of his jurisdiction, trying to trip us up. He ought to just get off this train and go back to where he belongs. It's not decent, hounding a grieving widow all the way to Chicago. It's hard enough taking Jimmy home without his interference or anyone else's," he added, cutting his sharp glance to me. "I'm sorry to have intruded," I said, getting to my feet. Kelly's suspicion was too hot. I wouldn't learn anything more asking questions just now. Besides, I was pretty sure I had learned what I'd set out to learn. Mrs. O'Halloran was innocent. I felt positive of that. But as for Mr. Kelly, his ideas about the police were not the ideas of an innocent man. He had the heart of a criminal. I was more convinced of that than ever. But he was protective of Mrs. O'Halloran, too. Maybe he was the kind of criminal I wanted to be, and if he was, I wanted to impress him. The only way I could think to do that now was with my discretion. I looked him square in the eye. "I won't say a thing to that cop, Mr. Kelly. You can count on me. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm feeling thirsty," I said. "I think I'll go see what they're serving in the lounge car." Mrs. O'Halloran nodded. "Thank you, Bobby Lee. You are a good boy." A good boy. She wouldn't think so if she knew about my plans to become a first-rate crook in Chicago. Good folks didn't get ahead in this world. Being good to me was what killed Mammon. I was done with good. So why did it warm my empty belly to hear her say it?